Hello, my name is Anne Marie Vander Zanden. I'm a professor of horticulture at Iowa State University, and the module I'd like to talk about today is Sustainable Landscapes, Planning and Design. In this module, I would like to talk about kind of an overview of sustainable landscaping, what it is and what the components are, about sustainability in general. And then I'll talk about 5 considerations that need to be thought about when you're creating a sustainable landscape. This graphic is pretty typical when it relates to as far as sustainability goes, and you'll see it oftentimes when people are trying to describe the intersection of people, profit, and planet, and things that are livable, equitable, and viable, and how that relates to something that's sustainable. So it's a great example of a Venn diagram, and in the middle where the people, the planet, and something that's profitable overlap is where you end up with a sustainable entity, and be that a sustainable landscape, sustainable business practices, anything like that will fit into this graphic. You can take this a step further when it relates to a successful landscape, and in order for a landscape to be successful in both the short and the long term, then you need to have good communication between the landscape designer, the landscape installer, and the landscape manager. So just as with sustainability, there's 3 components that are related to each other and that have to interact in order to be successful. The same is true when we're talking about the long and short-term success of a landscape as well. So there's really 5 considerations to think about when you're thinking about creating a sustainable landscape, and I'll talk in a little bit more detail about each one of them. We'll talk a little bit about working with the site conditions, talk a little bit about plant selection, practical turf areas, hardscape selection, and then design strategies that you can use to reduce runoff. And here we're talking about water runoff from a landscape site. Working with site conditions is probably the best place to start because it involves the initial planning and design phase of a landscape. When you're working with the existing site conditions, you want to maximize those features that are already present. In the case of the image here, this is a new housing development, and rather than drain the wetland or try to reroute the water, they really focused on emphasizing that wetland as a feature of the property and worked around it. In doing that, the other thing to consider is how you can limit site disruption during the construction. So wanting to eliminate erosion problems or site runoff, and then also eliminate or minimize the amount of compaction that occurs on the site. Anytime you don't have to make significant large-scale changes to the site, it's going to be a little bit less expensive from a development standpoint. Plant selection is another consideration. One of the best things that you can do to create a sustainable landscape is to use native or site-adapted species. And then choose plants that are either disease and insect resistant as well. Many tags now, when you go to a local nursery or a garden center, will have information that talk about their native location, and then also whether or not the plants are disease and insect resistant. The images highlight pin oak trying to grow on soils here in Iowa, which are too alkaline, and will always create this chlorosis effect on the leaves where they're yellow and then the veins themselves are a dark green. A much better option is to plant a different type of a tree that is better suited to our soils, particularly here in Iowa, and the same would be true, for any of those microclimates and unique environmental situations anywhere in the world. I enjoy looking at this picture because unless I told you that we were on the top of a, 10 or 12-story building in Utah, you might think that we're actually in an alpine, native alpine area. And this is a wonderful example of a green roof that was created in Utah, and it represents the native landscapes. It's a great way to increase the sustainability for the site and by reducing runoff and reducing the heat load, which are both benefits from green roofs. In looking at these two images, I'm going to ask whether or not they can be sustainable. If you look at that turf grass, it's beautiful, lush green stand. Clearly the picture on the left is in a desert area. There's not a lot of other green around it. And so you might wonder if it could be sustainable. And I would suggest that in fact it can be, because that is synthetic turf, just like the Boise State football stadium, only instead of being blue, it's a lovely color of green. Some of the new synthetic materials look very much like natural turf and can be used in growing conditions where water is an issue, or areas where maintenance would be too difficult, but that you still want to have that aesthetic of a kind of a carpet of green. Practical turf areas is another consideration just in general when it comes to sustainable landscapes. You want to make sure that the turf areas that are in the landscape are appropriately sized for mowing, for irrigating, and for fertilizing. The image on the top, I think, is a great example of bad design decisions, because there's no reason for that little patch of turf to be there. It's difficult to mow, difficult to water, and very difficult to fertilize as well. A ground cover of some sort would have been a much better alternative. Same with the picture on the right. It's kind of an extreme. It's an aesthetic is why it's there. But again, those sharp, steep slopes are going to be difficult to do any type of maintenance on, be it mowing, irrigating, or fertilizing. Practical turf areas also refers to using turf only where it makes sense. So in these particular cases, the one on the top, it's a very small postage stamp area. Rather than putting in natural turf, you might want to consider putting in one of the synthetic turfs, which is what is here in this image. Or areas that are time-consuming to mow, which you see on larger, more acreage-sized properties. That's an awful lot of turf grass to mow. Another alternative might be to put in a native prairie mix or some other turf mix that doesn't need to be mowed and maintained at the same level. Oftentimes people think that the turf uses a lot of water in a landscape, and it can use a fair amount of water depending upon the species and the time of year. But it's also important to remember that the trees in the landscape also use a lot of water. And so this image is just to show that in this beautiful turf area, the lawn trees, as evidenced by the brown patches around the trees, are really absorbing a lot of the soil moisture that's in that area. So just as an example, a mature oak tree will use about the same amount of water as an 1,800 square foot lawn area. That's a pretty significant area of lawn, so you can imagine that's a pretty significant amount of water that those oak trees are using. The other consideration in making a landscape more sustainable is the selection of your hardscape materials. So when possible, you can use sustainable materials by recycling existing products from a site. The image on the top is a residential property where the homeowners recycled boulders that they found during the excavation of the house and used those to create a natural wall. Recycled materials here on the bottom, these are recycled plastic and wood milling byproducts that are used to create decking material or other material you'd use in the landscape, like for railings and things like that. So they're just combined and extruded into different shapes and sizes and can be a very sustainable option. The other area of hardscapes are those paving surfaces. And so there's kind of three different kinds of permeable pavements. The first one is pervious concrete. It looks very much like a Rice Krispie treat, if you will, cookie. The picture there with the blue in the background kind of shows that. The water runs right through that concrete and then down into the soil profile underneath, and that's illustrated with the image there on the left. The image on the top right, the arrow is pointing to the space that is the pervious concrete in this particular development area. So the water runs down through the concrete, the pervious concrete, into the base material, the subbase, and then into the soil, rather than moving horizontally across the surface of the concrete and into some type of a storm water system. Another permeable pavement option is porous asphalt. It also allows water to move down through the profile of the asphalt into the subbase and then ultimately into the soil. You can see the picture on the top right with the woman who's kneeling down. The area behind her is traditional asphalt, and you can see that there's water sitting on top of it. The asphalt to the front of her is the porous asphalt, and the water has percolated down through the asphalt itself. And then the picture on the bottom also shows where the gentleman is pouring the water. That's the porous asphalt. The water is moving down through it. On the right-hand side is the traditional asphalt, and you can see that it's wet and there's actually ice on top of it as well. So depending upon the climate you're in, it may be an option to avoid having to deal with some of the icy conditions that get created during the winter time. And then the third type of permeable pavement are permeable pavers. In this case, the pavers themselves are not permeable, but the gaps in the spaces between them are. The profile picture shows kind of how the pavers are laid out, what the subbase looks like. The picture down in the middle shows a gentleman pouring a bucket of water right into those permeable pavers, and the water is moving right down through the profile. So all three of these options reduce the amount of horizontal water movement in a landscape after a rain event, for example, which will ultimately reduce runoff and increase your sustainability. The other way that you can reduce runoff is to design to reduce the runoff, and that really has to do with site grading and downspouts, particularly in residential properties. So this illustration shows the distance of the downspout. You can see to the right and to the left are rain gardens that are created by bermed areas. The water comes off of the roof down the downspout across the turf area and then stops when it gets to those rain gardens before moving on to a sidewalk or to the street. So just some thoughtful design approaches can reduce the runoff. Rain gardens themselves can also be used in commercial and residential settings. These are just a couple of examples. The one on the left, you can see the large curb cuts where the water would come across the street and into the rain garden. And the image on the right is just a cross section to kind of show how deep the rooting profile is and where the water would come in from a runoff standpoint, and then how the plant material might look as far as the types of trees or shrubs, as well as perennials that would be planted in that area. The bottom line when it comes to designing and planning a landscape is that if you have poor design, there's going to be a poor result. This picture shows a very poor design where you've got trees, turf, right adjacent to water, that it's going to be difficult to maintain that turf area. From a fertilizing standpoint, there'll likely be overthrow into the water feature, which can be a problem. You can also see the tree ties, the lighting elements, and then in this case, the other elements in the turf are outdoor speakers. All of that makes it very difficult to be maintained. You'll need to use a string trimmer. It's going to take a lot of additional time, and it's really just a poor design when it comes to sustainability and is not going to be easy to maintain in the long term. So those are some of the considerations I'd like you to think about as you think about sustainable landscape designing and planning. For some additional resources related to this, I would direct you towards the Great Plants for the Great Plains, which is a series of publications out of the Nebraska Extension Program, as well as Plants of Merit, which comes out of the Missouri Botanic Garden. Those both provide great resources on different plant materials that are native or site adapted and well suited for the Midwest. A couple of other extension publications I would encourage you to take a look at are from Iowa State University. One of them is landscape plants for the Midwest, a very extensive listing of plants that are well suited to our growing environment. And then the second one is sustainable home landscapes. And it goes into a little bit more detail than what I've talked about in the module here and gives some additional examples from a design standpoint, how you can either design a new landscape or even retrofit an existing landscape to make it more sustainable.